Good morning, everyone, and a blessed feast day of the triumphal entry of the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, into the temple, otherwise known as Palm Sunday, and also known as Willow Sunday. And we like to say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, at which you say, Hosanna in the highest. And I hope you're saying that from your homes in response. Right now, as we cry with those children with the palms of victory, all those 2 millennia ago, to Jesus, the King of Kings. And I'm blessed to be with you on this Sunday in your homes, and that your homes are able to be here through the marvelous technology that we have today. This feast, that of Palm Sunday, is one of the highest feast days. But many people don't know what it's really about. It is the feast of Christ as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. It is officially called the triumphal entrance of our Lord into Jerusalem. Now, to appreciate this, you have to know that, and of course, as we just heard, Christ entered and was welcomed by the city with palms and branches as the King of Kings. And to appreciate this, you have to know that Jerusalem is known as the city of the King. And in fact, as you will see shortly, this goes back a ways. It is properly the seat of the King of the Judeans, i.e. the King of the Jews, what was written about Christ's head by Pontius Pilate at the crucifixion nearly a week later. Long before the coming of Christ, the prophets foretold of Christ's entrance into Jerusalem. Zechariah the prophet wrote, "Behold, your king is coming to you, lowly and sitting on a donkey, a colt, the foal of an ass." That's in Zechariah 9, verse 9. At first, we might not think much of this passage. But there is a lot here. First, a king did not ride on the runt of a donkey. It's just not something that was done. This passage seems to indicate that Christ picked the runt of the litter to ride into Jerusalem. Of course, this catches people off guard because everyone knows the king rides the best and biggest horse, the grandest steed for a king. He doesn't ride on a donkey, much less the runt of the bunch. But Zechariah, centuries before, had predicted that Christ, as King of Kings, would do precisely that. Ride not on the greatest steed, but ride, as he says, lowly, humbly, on the runt of a donkey, as king. Moreover, the word sitting here should not be read passively. He comes sitting on the foal of a donkey. Sitting here means enthroned. So this is all the more striking, right? That Christ is enthroned. That he picked the most humble one to be enthroned on. He comes lowly, humbly, not like any other king. In order to understand all that takes place in Holy Week, in this upcoming week, we need to understand where Jerusalem is as the city of the King began. I want to take you back 1,000 years before the time of Christ, when God would raise up David, yes, the same David who killed Goliath, to be king of all Israel, with Jerusalem appointed by God as his capital. On Christ's mother's side, King David was Christ's great, etc., granddaddy. Christ was in the lineage of the king. Now, many think that Jerusalem, as back to King David, 1,000 years before Christ. But you know what? It goes back even further. In fact, I want to take you back even further, another 1,000 years. So 2,000 years before Christ. So as far before Christ as we are right now after Christ. 4,000 years ago, to the time of Abraham. Now Abraham was David's great, etc. granddaddy, which means that he was Christ's great, etc. grandfather. Now Abraham, 2,000 years before the coming of Christ, 4,000 years ago from our point of view, there was a war going on at that time between two sets of kingdoms, and the side that won the battle kidnapped Abraham's nephew. So Abraham went after this huge army, which was 300 men, in the middle of the night, to get back his nephew, as well as all the things that they had stolen. Abraham and 300 men went up against tens of thousands. But you know what? They won. He went back to the valley of Shaveh, which back then, so this is 2,000 years before the time that Christ is entering into Jerusalem. The valley of Shaveh was also known as the Valley of the King. It's where Jerusalem is today. But then it was called just Salem, Jerusalem, Salem. Jerusalem means city of peace. So at that time it was just called peace. And he met a mysterious person named Melchizedek. Melchizedek was, the Bible tells us, was both the king of Jerusalem, king of Salem, and also was the high priest, the priest of the Most High God. And so we can imagine that Jerusalem got its name because Salem was the whole land around it, and Jerusalem was the capital of the land, the city of the land, over which Melchizedek was king. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. Does this sound familiar? Brought forth bread and wine as an offering. And he was priest of the Most High God. And he blessed Abram, and said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thine hand." And Abraham gave him tithes of all that he had brought back. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. So, here we have an interesting thing. It was 2,000 years before Christ. This Melchizedek foreshadowed the Christ himself. The Christ, which means the anointed one, Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, Christos in Greek. The anointed one. The anointed what? Well, anointed both. Christ is anointed both as the great high priest and as the King of Kings. And Melchizedek was the only one who was anointed as both before Christ. That 2,000 years prior, as a foreshadowing of Christ himself. And that he met and had the sacrament with Abraham. Remember, right after this is when God promises Abraham that in Abraham's seed, singular, meaning the Christ, with the Messiah who would come, in Abraham's seed all of the nations would be blessed. Came right after he partook of the sacrament of the offered bread and wine by Melchizedek, who is both king and priest of the Most High God. So this is indeed beautiful and amazing as Abraham entered into Jerusalem to meet Melchizedek. So also Christ would come as the seed of Abraham into his city, the city of the great king. the city is also the great high priest. Jesus entering Jerusalem and being welcomed as its king by the crowds of the city who were crying out, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord," which the he there is not just anybody. That refers specifically, that was withheld as only a blessing for the Messiah once he came. Now, these people crying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord," had to be terrifying to the power structure. These people liked Herod as king. Many years long before that, his father, Herod the Great, was already paranoid. Right when Christ was born, he was already paranoid that the Messiah was coming. People are saying, we've seen stars in the sky, and we think the Messiah's come. Uh-oh. And Herod the Great was worried, because if the Messiah came, that means that he would have to give up his throne as king. So his son was also becoming worried about that, and all of his friends were also worried about that. Things were going good. The money changers were flowing well. And people liked their level of corruption at that time. And they knew the Messiah would come and straighten it all out. And they didn't like that. They liked their kickbacks. They liked their corrupt way of life. They got used to it. They didn't want time for God. Let God be put off to later in life. I want to ask you, do we do that sometimes? Do we put God in the corner? Well, in any case, we're now sitting in a house, and sometimes people are maybe getting on each other's nerves, and we need to be more patient with each other in some of our homes, perhaps. I want to tell you a story. Many years ago, a plague hit across the seas, and a man and his wife had to take in first their parents, and then their brothers and sisters, and brothers and sisters-in-law lost their jobs and their homes during this plague, and had to move in along with their children, all into the same household. So the guy went to his priest and he says, "Father, I don't know what to do. I feel like I can't breathe, and that there's no room in my house. There's arguing all the time, and it's too crowded, and I can't stand it." The priest says, "You have a farm. Bring 2 goats into the house." So the man thought that the priest was a little bit crazy for saying so, but he did it just in case it worked. So the man did what the priest said, and came back a week later and says, "Father, that is no good. They're still arguing. There's still no room in the house, and I'm still going crazy." And the priest says, "Bring in 4 sheep and 2 watchdogs." So the man says, "Bring in more animals into the house." So the guy goes back, does what the priest says, and comes back a week later and says, "Father, that did no good, and I'm going out of my mind." And the priest said, "Okay, go home and let all the animals back outside." The man came back the next day and says, "Thank you, Father. That did the trick. There's so much room now." The point is, our perspective needs to change. And sometimes we need to do things to make our perspective change. The fact is that as our lives go on, our unselfish leanings rot us from the inside. They corrupt us from the inside. We become like Christ culturally. We become like Jerusalem culturally at the time of Christ. And these things corrode us from the inside. What happens when a pipe corrodes? Well, it leaks. And eventually the water cannot go through the pipes anymore, and it bursts out the sides. The same thing with our souls. Our soul is a system of spiritual pipes meant to infuse ourselves with the grace of God, that need redeemed from corruption and corrosion perpetually. recently that reflected it. So many of us get sensitive about people when they treat us maybe wrongly, right? But when people treat you wrongly, you just have to realize that might have to do more with their internal struggle than it ever did with you. Just like in the Jerusalem, we people are sometimes fickle. And the people would be easily turned away from Christ within a week by the authorities that be, by the naysayers. And we can't be so fickle. We need to stand strong. We were given that power of the Holy Spirit. We are sons of the King and daughters of the King. We are inheritors of the kingdom. And we need to stand strong and not bend with the wind that our political leaders want us to do, bend with, that the people in Hollywood or our favorite actors want us to do. Let's follow. This is our guide. Today we're faced with discovering the true meaning of what all the feasts really mean. Hopefully, we face the fast not with indulgence, but with it being an opportunity to read more about the faith, to pray more, and to be sober-minded in a world that is going corrupt. Not being able to go to church, we are learning not to take God's house for granted, not to take going to God's house for granted. We are learning that Palm Sunday is not about going to church and getting blessed lucky charms in the forms of palms and branches for the household. It is about Christ and what we can give Him as King of Kings, not about what we get from Him. That is what worship is supposed to be about. We're not to go to church to get something out of it, but rather to put something into it. And it's there that we'll gain by emptying kenosis, self-emptying. And now is the only thing that we can do is put something into it. The gift of our hearts and the communion of our prayers. We are learning to turn our hearts into the temple of God and our homes into what God gave them to us to be, the little church of the Lord. Archbishop Daniel said about Lazarus yesterday, the righteous Lazarus was resurrected after 4 days in the tomb. It's time for us to be resurrected after 4 weeks in the virtual tomb of pandemic quarantine. It's time we heard Christ calling to us and lived again. Let our pride, ego, and selfishness remain buried, though, in the tomb as we rise. And let our new lives overflow with love, compassion, and humility. Having been called yesterday from the spiritual deadness of our lives, was Lazarus unto spiritual life. Let us today make our hearts and homes into a new Jerusalem. Let us truly welcome Christ as King into our lives, not part of our lives. If He's King, He calls the shots. God should not be part of our lives. He shouldn't be parked in some corner that we only pull out when we need Him. We need to take seriously the principles that He laid for us to live happy and healthy lives and do them. Christ, our King, enter into our hearts. Take the steering wheel and guide us rightly. And help us to love You, to help us to love Your Father and the Holy Spirit and one another. Help us to love one another as You have loved us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.